All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We're looking at a deeply unconventional text by Ryuho Okawa. Specifically, we're diving into Part 2, recorded back on June 29, 2010, focusing on Chapter 3. The big topic here? The complex relationship between a nation's defense spending and its overall economy. You know, every major country wrestles with how wealth and military power intersect. But while most standard analyses just stop at budget numbers, this source material takes us on a pretty wild journey. We go from straightforward economic theory to a highly spiritual, really unexpected take on modern geopolitics. So, if you like exploring thought-provoking frameworks that totally challenge the status quo, you're definitely in the right place.
Now, the author grounds this whole complex discussion with an incredibly simple metaphor. They write, deterrence is about making sure a thief cannot enter. It's great because it cuts right through all that dense political jargon we usually hear. We hear the word deterrence thrown around all the time in international relations, but at its core, the text is saying it's literally just like putting a heavy lock on your front door. You don't buy a lock because you want to get into a fight, right? You buy it so that anyone looking to steal what you've built decides it's just not worth the hassle. It's about securing your hard-earned wealth.
So, to unpack all of this, we're going to cover three main areas today. Number one, the economic logic. Number two, the international reality. And finally, number three, the spiritual perspective. Let's get into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the economic logic, and looking at deterrence as a security guard. So, the really crucial point here is how the author tackles a common economic contradiction. You often hear people ask, hey, if a nation wants a small government, lower taxes, less state intervention, doesn't that mean they have to slash defense spending too? Well, the author explicitly argues no. In fact, they say these goals are entirely compatible. According to the text, a booming economy absolutely requires a safe environment to function. Defense isn't just some bloated government program. It's the fundamental prerequisite that allows a free market economy to actually exist without being dismantled by outside forces.
To really hit the nail on the head, the author uses this brilliant analogy of a small 100 yen shop. A little shop like that operates on a pretty small scale, right? Sure, a thief might wander in occasionally, but for the most part, the shop can rely on the general goodness of people. Hiring a full-time, expensive security guard just wouldn't make economic sense. But, the author argues, a nation with a massive GDP is a completely different story. A high GDP country is essentially a giant bank vault. It holds so much concentrated wealth that it becomes a prime target on the global stage. Because of that immense risk, it absolutely requires the heavy security guard of military deterrence. Basically, the sheer scale of your wealth dictates the scale of the defense you need.
Moving on to Section 2, the international reality, where we'll look at diplomatic voice and trade.
Looking at how this plays out in the real world, the text uses Japan as its main case study. For decades now, Japan has been this massive economic powerhouse, right? They consistently pay huge financial dues to the United Nations, historically ranking as the first or second highest contributor in the world. And yet, as the author points out, Japan continually struggles to secure a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The source material argues this is the direct result of neglecting defense. Despite having all this immense wealth, lacking credible military deterrence drastically lowers a nation's voice and diplomatic leverage in the international community. The takeaway here is that money alone simply does not buy true geopolitical influence.
But it goes deeper than just UN seats. There's a real cascading effect on the economy. The author argues that military deterrence is absolutely vital for guaranteeing fairness in international trade. Without it, you just can't ensure mutually beneficial outcomes. To prove this point, the text points back to historical colonialism, specifically the trade relationship between Britain and India over a century ago. The author notes that because India lacked a comparable military defense, the trade became this one-sided wealth extraction. It left India impoverished while Britain grew massively wealthy. So the stark warning is, without that lock on the door, international trade can quickly devolve into systemic exploitation.
And that brings us to Section 3, the spiritual perspective. This is where we look at geopolitics and spirits.
Now, this is where the explainer takes a highly unconventional turn. The author introduces a spiritual element, claiming to channel the spirit of Adam Smith. Yes, the famous 18th century father of modern economics. Through this spiritual perspective, the text shares a warning from Adam Smith that Japan, or really any wealthy but underdefended nation, must establish true self-reliance. The message here is that if a country relies solely on its economic output, but lacks the independent strength to actually defend it, it risks basically becoming a colony. The channeled warning is that without a strong defense, all that hard-earned wealth will just be absorbed by foreign powers.
Applying the spiritual lens to modern superpowers, the text makes a really striking claim about China. Conventionally, we look at Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening policy as a shift toward free markets to, improve the lives of everyday citizens. But according to the channeled spirit in this text, that economic liberalization had a very different ulterior motive. The source argues that the true calculated aim of the reform and opening was specifically to generate massive national wealth for the explicit purpose of funding aggressive military expansion. In this view, economic integration wasn't about domestic prosperity. It was actually a strategic tool for military dominance.
Which brings us to arguably the most provocative claim in the book's spiritual analysis. The author introduces this concept called the law of same wavelengths. It's this idea that similar minds and intentions naturally attract each other across both the physical and spiritual realms. And through this principle, the text asserts that the spirit of Adolf Hitler is naturally drawn to and is currently approaching the Chinese leadership. The author states this is happening because the leadership's heavy pivot toward military expansionism is operating on the exact same psychological and spiritual wavelength as historical totalitarian aggression.
So, synthesizing all of this, there is obviously a vast difference between standard geopolitical thinking and the unique thesis of this book. On one side, the conventional viewpoint assumes that a nation's economic rise naturally leads to peaceful global integration, driven purely by material policies. But on the other hand, the book's spiritual viewpoint argues the complete opposite. It suggests that an economic rise can just be a strategic front for military ambition, and that global events are actively being influenced by the spirits of historical figures. It's a framework that really asks you to look at modern defense not just as a matter of spreadsheets and policy, but as a reflection of underlying spiritual intentions.
And that brings us to our final takeaway for today. Whether you're looking at this through the practical lens of a security guard protecting a shop, or through these highly unconventional spiritual warnings, the source material really forces a critical evaluation of a nation's priorities. You simply cannot separate a country's bank account from its physical security. So, having gone through this analysis, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. How do economic security, military deterrence, and fundamentally unique ideological perspectives shape the intense foreign policy debates we're seeing in our own nations right now? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating explainer with me, and keep questioning those deeper layers of the global stage.